I'm really excited to introduce you to a panel of powerhouse prototypers who will be coming at you with new ideas, perspectives, and provocations. They're going to be sharing their real-world solutions that are being developed and tested by communities, tangible learnings, tangible things that are happening. And in important context, we've asked each one of them not just to share what they've done and what they've learned, but where they've struggled, where they've faced challenges, where they've taken risks, and perhaps where they've also failed. So, suffice to say, to get up on stage and talk about where things don't work out is a hard thing to do, so it takes a lot of courage to be up here, and I'm really excited first and foremost to introduce you to Diane Roussin from the Winnipeg Boldness Project, a research and development project demonstrating how prototyping can be transformative yet replicable. Diane will share with us a new lens for economic development that combines social, science, and Indigenous approaches. Please join me in welcoming Diane. Hi, good luck.
Thank you. Hanin and Buzu, hello. And now you know what that means, thanks to Lindy. That's awesome. I'm also Anishinaabe, so Anishinaabe are ruling the morning today. Woohoo! That's awesome. And I joke about that, but I'm also very serious about that. Lindy just asked, are we creating space and place for Indigenous knowledge systems, and just having the 20 minutes or so to do a land acknowledgement, there's an evolution happening, because usually you only get a minute to do it. And so to really think about this place that we're gathered in, I think is incredible. And being asked to come here today and speak to you about some of the stuff that I've been doing, the project I'm working on is very much about centering Indigenous wisdom, and so I'm very honored to be up here following Lindy and talking about how we are centering that Indigenous wisdom and how we're creating that space and place for the work that we're doing, some of the work that we're doing in Winnipeg. And I was really excited when I started, this is the second annual, I didn't come to the first, and so trying to learn about who is this group and who's in the room, and I was really quite excited that it's a room full of folks who are into change making, and they're thinking about what kind of change we want to make and then how we're going to make that change. Again, I don't think we have enough of those kinds of conversations anywhere, so to be in a room of this size with this many people is quite exciting for me. Let's see if I can get this to go. Here we go. So as you heard in the introduction, this project I'm working on called the Winnipeg Boldness Project, it's a social lab. So it's a research and development project that is using a social lab platform. So we are doing things like prototyping and trying to figure out how to scale those prototypes. We're focused in a particular neighborhood in Winnipeg, which is usually called sort of the north end of Winnipeg, and usually that neighborhood is described by mainstream media, I'll pick on them for a second, in a very challenging way. And so it's usually portrayed very negatively. And that's not my experience in the North End, but that's how it very often gets portrayed. So that's where we're situated. And we started by looking at early childhood development. That was the frame. So what is this challenge that we're trying to solve for in our lab? And talking about the failure, I don't really like using the word failure. I don't know if most of us do, but I like talking about what we've learned. And so right at the very outset, we had a group of stakeholders that had come together who really wanted to think about what can we do differently about early childhood development, because some of the data and the scores were telling us that kids were showing up at school not school ready. And so when I got asked to be a part of that conversation, I knew immediately, just given who I am, because I'm an Anishinaabe person who's been kicking around in Winnipeg for quite some time, and I know that my community has a lot to say about that issue, and they have a lot of solutions, and they have a lot of answers, and they really know how to properly define that problem. And so I knew we had to go straight into community and ask the question. And so even when we started to say early childhood development and school readiness, as soon as we went back into our community and asked our community, this is some of our community, what they thought, they said to us, well, why just school? Like, why would you only focus on school? Like, if we're going to talk about good, success for kids, why wouldn't we talk about that in a broader way, not just about school? And so right at the outset, we were like, oh, so a little course correction there about, instead of maybe focusing solely on school readiness, that we're gonna think about what are all the different factors that contribute to making kids successful. And to me, that's an Indigenous way of thinking, because we try to think about interconnectedness and we try to think holistically instead of, sort of these, because there's so many things that go into making kids successful in school, and if they're successful in school, they're gonna be successful in a whole bunch of other realms. And so our community told us lots. So these are this is Glenn up in the corner. He's a little bit older now. This picture's a little bit dated, but this is Landon right here at the bottom, and Miranda, his mom. And so all of these babies some of them weren't even born when we started Boldness, and so now they're growing up, and the families, the parents, the kids, they're really informing what we're doing all throughout our whole entire process. So when we talked about the school readiness piece, they said, well, if you want kids to be successful there, we need to take a step back, and some of the stuff that you were talking about, we need to know our histories, we need to know our culture, we need to know our identity, we need to know our languages. And so that's where the project ended up starting versus maybe into school readiness kinds of conversations. We started talking about identity and foundations of human beings. And our community said that there is this way of working in our neighborhood that's really good for kids and families. And that way of working typically isn't built into many of the systems that have been set up to serve our families. And so they wanted us to write down this way of working in our neighborhood. So now we call it our theory of change. That's not how we started. We just started talking about this way of working and what did it mean and what did it look like. And so this is a visual representation of a model. You can go on our website and it's like a 40-page document. You can download this. But they told us to write it down, and they told us like all the things that lead to change. And so we were able to then put language around it called theories of change. And it flows from, this deep relationships, this network of deep relationships that we have in the neighborhood. This has been around, again, we've put this Wordle together and we've put a title on it, but this way of working has been around in this neighborhood for generations. Like, it was passed down to me, and there's a group of people that it was passed down to them, and so on and so forth. So it's very intergenerational, and it's been around for a long time. And it's based on a fundamental belief that our families, those ones that are experiencing all those challenges, they fundamentally know what they need. There are so many systems out there that don't believe that. They think our families are too challenged, too broken, too this, too that they don't actually know what they need. They do. It's trying to get there. That's always the challenge, and that's where systems kind of come into place, and they get in the way. And the examples I like to give of systems is that in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, we have 11,000 children in the care of Child Family Services. That was in 2018. $500 million for that system in that year. 95% of those kids are Indigenous. 95%. We are not 95% of the population in Winnipeg. We're like maybe 10%, maybe 20%. The justice system, conservatively speaking, 75% of those that are incarcerated in Manitoba are Indigenous. And those numbers carry across every single system, which speaks to not individual capacity, because it doesn't mean that Indigenous people that they don't know how to parent, or that they're criminals, or they don't know how to take care of their health, or they don't know how to run businesses. That is not the case. We have the individual capacity to do those things. It's the systems that get in the way and perpetuate those numbers. And so the Boldness Project is very much about using the community wisdom to figure out how we might start to have impact on those numbers and on those systems. One example that I like to give is because this one sort of is the most black and white example in our prototyping of when we center community wisdom, what happens. There is an issue in Winnipeg around infant mortality, and infant mortality is an issue in many parts of the world. And so this concept of a baby box as an answer to infant mortality has been around since the 30s, and it's come from Finland, and it's done great things in Finland. And just most recently, there's a lot of people in Winnipeg who went, infant mortality is an issue, so we need a solution, so let's do this baby box thing because it's worked in other places. Well, when we went to our community and said, okay, hold up, because again, when we look at the infant mortality issue, typically people are pointing at families in the North End as the folks that are being most affected by the infant mortality issue. And our community told us this. They said, why are we talking about keeping babies alive? Because a baby box is a safe sleep surface, which is then used to deal with this infant mortality issue. Our community said, why are we talking about keeping the babies alive? Can we not raise the bar just a little bit higher, and can we not talk about thriving children? Alive, thrive. And then they said, we need a customized solution, not a standardized solution. Baby box is very standardized. You go on the website, you can order it, you drop button, click down, it's delivered to your door. They said that we need somebody to come to the door with it. We need to be in relationship with one another versus this transactional approach. We need it to be, certain families need certain things. Can we not target this? Why does it have to be universal? Not everybody needs the same thing. And the idea that, these concepts are based on concepts of equity, not equality. Equal means everyone in this room gets the exact same thing and then we're equal, right? No. All of us in this room start at a different place, and some of us are here and some of us are here, and the concept of equality is this space, and that's the space we need to work at to get us. And so our community knows that, and they showed us that in the baby box prototyping process. I would say that, I've just got a few more minutes here, but we start in the community, and then we branch out and reach out to our partners, because the lab requires and necessitates the need for collaboration and the need for multi-sectoral collaboration. And so folks need to understand that our families can start the solution, but then how do we create and generate the solution they're talking about? That's where we need the whole city to be involved. And so what is the role and what is the place and what resource can you bring to bear on this conversation? I was asked to speak a little bit about, and so we bring together lots of the community wisdom with the mainstream science and see how we can both move forward there. I was asked to talk a little bit about what is it that we could replicate and scale. And I think the thing that we can replicate and scale anywhere is relationships. This is so relationship dependent. And the trust building that goes on when we have the space and place for relationship, it fosters really high trust levels. And when you have really high trust levels, that's when you can experiment, that's when you can take risks, that's when you can fail. And that's where things like iteration, emergence, all these words you know about, the generative processes happen when we create place and space for that. And so we need to have the platforms, we need to be very intentional, we need to be very purposeful in creating those platforms. And I think it's those kinds of platforms that give the space for other knowledge systems like Indigenous knowledge. And I have seen that experience in Winnipeg for sure. So our model fundamentally believes in the capacity of Indigenous knowledge systems, and that Indigenous knowledge systems can be privileged in the solution finding conversation. We're naturally entrepreneurial, we're naturally systems thinkers, and so it's quite natural for us. I want to leave you with the last thing that in this relationship conversation, that our knowledge systems are very much about interconnectedness, and how do we achieve that interconnectedness. And in social innovation world, we talk about ecosystems. Well, this is a recognition of that ecosystem, and you've often probably heard the saying, all my relations. And all my relations means we are humans, which is but one of the relatives on this planet. We have the trees and the water, and we can learn from the water and the trees, and like what we said earlier, right? That the water has so much to teach us, and so all my relations is about all of us. And the final thought that I want to leave you with, and I really want, this is a snappy saying, but there's so much to it. Innovation requires us to think outside the box, and we absolutely need to do that. But I found when we really get transformational, it's when we're thinking inside the circle. And that's what I want to end on, so miigwech.
Thank you so much, Diane. I cannot think of a better start to the topic of community solutions than what you just provided. So miigwech. And next, we're actually going to gaze across the pond, and we're going to welcome UK's Vidya Alexson, who is rethinking land ownership to recapture community wealth and give communities control over their places. Vidya is the founding chief executive of Power to Change, an independent trust established in 2015 to support the growth of community businesses across England. Vidya?
Good morning, everybody, and a really huge thank you for the opportunity to be here. What I'm going to say on the surface of things is very different from what Diane spoke about, but something that she said really chimes with what I'm going to talk about. She said that our families fundamentally know what they need, and I think the work that we're doing at Power to Change starts from exactly the same place. We really believe that communities themselves know what they need to thrive, and we need to empower them to be able to shape their futures. So that's really a connection, I think, that runs between the two talks. So I think one of the sharpest challenges we face in cities in the UK, and we're definitely not alone in this, is creating broad-based wealth, inclusive economies that benefit all parts of the city and all of its people. So this is Liverpool, home of the Beatles, and it's a city that's been largely transformed over the last 30 years. But as you can see from the picture, not everybody in that city is sharing those benefits. And recently in the UK, we've been starting to ask questions about why, despite decades of regeneration and billions of pounds, we're still searching for this more inclusive economy. We've still got these significant pockets of deprivation that just seem to be stubbornly there. And I think this recent review, which was conducted by something called the Community Wealth Alliance in the UK, came up with a range of factors that they found underpin successful neighbourhood regeneration. And I want to draw out a few of those because I think they're ones that are often ignored. The first is community control. The second is enabling communities to accumulate and build assets. And the third is the importance of social capital and social infrastructure. So Power to Change was established in 2015 with a spend-out endowment of £150 million to really spearhead a different approach to building local economies by focusing on driving up community control, community ownership through the growth of community business. We disproportionately invest in the 30% most deprived parts of England, and we take a systems approach. So we support individual businesses, we shape the market within which they operate, we influence policy, and we're trying to build a robust evidence to make the case for community business. We define community businesses as organisations that are locally rooted and locally led. They're not just in a place, they are of that place. They generate a significant share of their revenue from trading, and they trade for the benefit of their wider community, reinvesting profits back into the local area. They are part of the social enterprise family that many of you will be familiar with, but we see them as being distinct in their local connection and accountability to local people. And community business is not a new approach. In fact, it's centuries old. Communities have long come together through enterprise to deliver social purpose. But in the UK, we're seeing renewed energy behind communities looking for new solutions in the face of institutional failure on multiple levels. And community business is one of those approaches that people are turning towards. I don't have nearly enough time to do justice to the amazing work that's going on in community businesses across England, but I wanted to give you 3 examples that I think really illustrate what community ownership, community control can deliver in terms of changing local economies. So the first is Home Baked. It's an area that's in Anfield in the shadow of the world-famous Liverpool Football Club. The community started its journey a few years ago when members of the community came together to reopen a local bakery. So there'd been a bakery on the edge of that street, on the corner, for over 100 years, but Mitchell's, the bakery, had closed, and the community really wanted to reopen that bakery. So they came together and started a community-run, community-led bakery called Home Baked. It now turns over revenue about £300,000, and most of that revenue is reinvested back into the local area through local employment and through the use of local suppliers. But the community always had a much bigger vision than just the bakery. They wanted to transform that entire row of houses that you can see, which have lain empty for about a decade now. So a few years ago, having work to establish their confidence as a community and their credibility with funders, with the local authorities. They managed to take ownership through a community land trust of that entire terrace, and they're working with local people through the community land trust to now bring that whole terrace back to life as a new future high street with a mix of housing, with a mix of workspace and commercial space. Moving on to back on the map, it's in a place in the northeast of England called Sunderland. And like many of our smaller cities in the north, one of the real challenges it currently faces is very low property values. And what that means is that the area is being flooded by lots of private sector landlords who are buying up properties here, there, and everywhere, but they're largely absent, and they're not looking after the place or curating the place in any way. So what Back on the Map is doing is buying up those properties when they become available, refurbishing them, and letting them at an affordable rate. So it currently owns about 64 properties worth about 4.1 million, and it generates about £350,000 in rental income. But really what it's doing is much more than buying those houses. It's trying to cluster those properties and bring stability back to neighbourhoods, reimagine community, bring people back together. It's really looking after the entire place, the whole neighbourhood, not just those individual houses. And some of the money that it generates from that asset base that it has through that rent, it's reinvesting into a community hub. So it's taken over a library from the local authority who can no longer afford to run that library, and it's using that building as a way of having deep impact in its community, running a whole range of services that the community needs but that are no longer provided. And then finally, White Rock Neighbourhood Ventures. It's in a place called Hastings on the south coast of England, an area of deprivation, but one that is gradually seeing regeneration and gentrification kind of knocking on the door. So what the community organisation is doing in partnership with several others is buying up many of the empty properties in the area and bringing them back into use. They currently own 7 properties as a consortium, and the first Rock House has already been brought back into use as a mixture of workspace, housing and community space, and the other buildings over the next 5 years will gradually be brought back into use. Critically, what this group of community organisations is trying to do is, through community ownership, trap some of the benefits of gentrification for local people, ensure that prices and rents can be managed to ensure that local people who are currently there can still benefit once gentrification takes hold, and that they're not pushed out, and that the wealth that's created through gentrification doesn't go elsewhere. And I think each of the examples that I've given really illustrate how community businesses can build local wealth. So by reinvesting money locally through employment, through using local suppliers, they are significant local multipliers, as we saw with that home-baked example. By owning assets and managing prices and rents, as we saw with White Rock Neighbourhood Ventures in Hastings, they're able to trap that wealth for local people. And finally, by reinvesting their profits back into local areas, as we saw with Back on the Map running its community hub, they can really have deep impact in their communities. And critically, one of the things all of those examples do that is really fundamental is that they give local people a sense of power and control over their future, over their local area. And it's something, particularly in the UK, and I saw on the TV as I arrived last night, the newscaster laughing about Brexit. We're in a pretty bad place in the UK with our politics, and people feel a real disconnection from what's going on. Community business is a way of giving people a real stake in economic decision-making, enabling them to really participate. And I think community business is a critical part of moving from a more extractive economy to one that really builds local wealth and can really substantially address the inequality that we're still seeing in our cities. Some of you will know these. They're the 8 principles of community wealth building as set out by Democracy Collaborative in DC. And I've highlighted the 4 that I think are particularly significant in the context of community business. It's going to take a lot more than community business to build a new economic system, let's be clear, but I think community business can play a really important part. So what have we at Power to Change done to try and enable the growth of this movement of community businesses across England? I want to just give you 3 examples. What we really tried to do as much as possible is bring down some of the barriers that these community organisations face towards growth and thriving. So one of those is the difficulty they face in accumulating assets. So often in a private market, in a private sale, they can't accumulate the money that they need to buy that building or buy whatever it is in time, and some of the transactions can be complex. So one of the things we've done in one of those markets, in community energy, is we formed a joint venture with a social investment partner in the UK called Big Society Capital. We formed a £40 million joint venture. We've bought 6 solar farms. So that's 40 megawatts of solar generation, energy generation. And we're now working with those community businesses over the next 3 to 5 years to buy those assets off us. So each asset is worth several million. Some of them are worth about £6 million. Those community businesses would have really struggled without our intervention to raise that kind of money. So we took those assets out of the private market, are holding them as custodians for long-term community ownership, and we'll work over time to move those assets into community ownership and generate substantial benefits for those communities. Next, another thing that businesses really struggle with is access to long-term patient finance. They can often get debt, but it's quite expensive, and we are struggling in the UK with grant funding. It's much less available after a decade of austerity than it ever was. So one of the things that we've done is use our money alongside community investment to really try and boost community investment and draw more investors in. So through something in the UK called Community Shares, we've invested alongside local people and used just over £1 million of our money to draw in close to £10 million of local investment by individuals in communities that really want to support these kinds of businesses. And we've been able to draw in over 10,000 individuals into this kind of investment. So some of these people are only investing small amounts, £50, £100, because they really want to back something that's happening locally. And it's really powerful money because it builds that community ownership right into the heart of these organisations. And then the final example goes back to Liverpool. So as a time-limited organisation, and we were set up to be a sort of a decade-long project, and will hopefully last a bit longer than that if we can raise some more money, but we definitely won't be here forever. Part of our job is to make the case so that others will come in alongside us and follow our lead. We need to make a strong enough case for community business that if we were to close our doors, other money, other support would be coming in to continue this movement. And so we were really delighted. We've been working for the last couple of years in the Liverpool area to make the case for community business and the social economy as a really fundamental part of creating the inclusive economy that they say they want. And we were delighted that a few weeks ago, the mayor, Steve Rotherham, up in the Liverpool City region, announced a £5 million commitment to the social economy to grow community businesses and social enterprises. And what was really significant for me about that was that he took that money from what he calls the strategic investment funds. Most of that money normally goes to hard infrastructure, to property development, to much more conventional ways of growing economies. So to get that sort of recognition that the social economy should be part of it, that building that social infrastructure is a route to economic success, was for us really important. And I just want to close by saying, I've told you about some of the successful things we've done. We've also tried many things that haven't worked. But in everything that we do, we're guided by our 4 organisational values, and they are bold, informed, open and collaborative. So we try and take risks. We learn from the mistakes that we make as well as the things that go well. We share our learning. We're very open about where things haven't worked, and we try wherever possible to work in partnership with other organisations, because the task that we're all face today is far more urgent than any of us can tackle on our own. So partnership is really at the core of what we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vidya. What an inspiring series of stories. All right, to close out this part of the programming, we have a keynote from Gabriella Goméz-Mont. Now, this is an incredible bio. Gabriella was named one of the 100 most creative people in business by Fast Company magazine. She's the founder of Laboratorio para la Ciudad, the award-winning experimental arm of the Mexico City government in the years of 2013 to 2018. She now directs Experimentalista, a new type of nomadic and creative office that specializes in cities and constantly shifts shape to accommodate high-level transdisciplinary collaborations across the world. Welcome, Gabriella.
Hello, Toronto, and thank you for the snow, because as a resident of Mexico City, I rarely get to see these beautiful landscapes. So even though I know that a lot of you are slightly sad to see the winter creeping up, I'm really, really happy to get a little bit of white. So basically, I was the Chief Creative Officer for Mexico City for 5 years and a half. And for those of you who ask why Chief Creative Officer, why not a Chief Digital Officer or Innovation Officer is more common in other cities, from the very onset, one of the things that I proposed to the mayor is that we really wanted to think that our hope cannot be in technology. It has to be in humanity. And more specifically, the thing that brings us here, which is our communities. So this social structuring of our cities, I think, is incredibly important. And how do we actually start figuring out these invisible, sometimes imaginary lines that cross not only our cities and very literally our bodies, and how many times everything from public space to society gets coded in ways that are a little bit more difficult to grasp. So I wanted to start off being a Chief Creative Officer and believing hugely in the arts and humanities with a couple of examples that make this very clear. For who has been to Mexico City in this room, if I could see your raise of hands? Okay, a lot of you. I'm very happy to hear that. Trump has done us a favor in terms of, just like the amount of people coming, jumping across the borders. So this, as you know, is the Zócalo, which is our main square in Mexico City. It's one of the biggest main squares in the world. And so I'm sure you know it. What you might not know, because maybe you didn't get a taste of this when you were there, is that Mexico City has this really weird obsession with breaking records. So this plaza has seen everything from, the #1 record of people dancing to Michael Jackson's Thriller, to this one that you see here, which is work by Spencer Tunick, so that many of you might be familiar with. He loves getting people naked in public space. And so basically his record was Mexico City. So what you see there, a little bit from far away, for those who are of more sensitive nature, is 18,000 smiling butts looking up at you. So I love talking about this work, first of all, because I find it very funny and it speaks so closely to the quirky nature of Mexico City. But it's truly interesting because what you see here was a day of celebration in public space. We had, as you can imagine, it was a euphoric day where everybody is getting naked at once, and we were just about to break a record and so. But then something happened that was quite interesting and also quite disturbing, which is Spencer Tunick decided that he only wanted women in a picture. So he sent the men to get dressed, and only the women were left. And suddenly this space of celebration became very quickly, just because we changed one single thing, into a space of contestation. Because then the leer started, and then the intensity started, and it became a really uncomfortable thing. So I think that this again, speaks to the fact that we can not only think about the built environment when we're thinking about cities, but also the social energies that traverse it and restructure it continuously. And in every space across the city, the whole city converges and all of our social norms. So we have to think very closely about that. On a very different side of the world, I'll talk about a work of Jens Hanning, who's an artist from Copenhagen. But so he was commissioned to work on public space as well, in a plaza in Frankfurt that has an important, it was a very affluent plaza where you have a mix of all sorts of people coming together. And it also had an important community of Turkish people living close by, and there had been like a whole lot of contestation around immigration policies and such. So what Jens did was very simple, but I think also very powerful to speak about these things that are more difficult to grasp, is that he took the public, whatever they're called, that you see there that I'm forgetting the word, and he started amplifying jokes in Turkish. And so basically, suddenly, from this community where the people that are from Turkey were the outsiders, if you will, the unwelcome, the silent, suddenly you see popping up a very different community to the one that you would have thought of. And it also articulated the plaza in a very different way. And then we have, of course, our borders. This is a picture by Pablo López Luz of the American-Mexican border. That is the second largest border in the world and one of the most contested. And I believe that here we come face to face with the fact that the invisible forces and energy that crisscross, as I mentioned, our cities and our bodies and our nations are invisible, often even imaginary, but they become incredibly real in their very palpable effects. So this imaginary border that we have created also attests to the fact that nowadays, a body from a different place that are placed in these, I'd say yes, concentration camps, is now worth $50,000 to $60,000 for private industry across the US. So how do we really think about these things and these imaginaries that we have created? So this brings me to Laboratorio para la Ciudad, which was the lab that I ran for 5.5 years. It was actually the experimental office and creative think tank for the Mexico City government. And as all of you probably know, there's a whole family of labs worldwide, and we have several things in common, such as the fact that we are a place for government to try things out and to fail forward, as they will say, and also not put at risk the rest of the government, so that then when we find different ways of being government, they can seep back into the rest of the public institution or the city itself. Another thing I think that we also do is try to do something with this paradox where we're seeing that there's every time more mistrust between governments and civil society, and at the same time, and I think this room attests to this, is we're seeing more and more interest of people to sink their hands into the city and to really help create the cities around them. So how do you actually create a very different notion of government where people that want to do most for the cities are actually most comfortable with a close relationship with their public institutions and their public officials? This was not an easy feat in Mexico City. This is what the levels of Untrust look like. And the last Pew survey that we had about 2 years ago said that only 8% of Mexicans actually believe in democracy. So as you can imagine, when I stepped into government, and since we had to be a strange attractor, this was not necessarily an easy thing to contend with. So besides the mistrust that was very different to our counterparts, let's say in Copenhagen or the lab that had been born in Helsinki, Mexico City was also very much something that gave us our flavor because we were a brainchild, if you will, of the city where we live in. So for those of you who don't know, Mexico City is 21 million people in the metropolitan area. 9.5 million people city proper, with 6 million people coming every day into work. We are an incredibly diverse city. I think actually the diversity of Mexico City is one of its hugest assets, but unfortunately this also many times plays out in inequality. So we have both the #1 ex-billionaire of the world, as well as one of the lowest minimum wages across all of Latin America, let alone the OECD country. So, as you can imagine, suddenly you are offered to create a new city department by the mayor, the incoming mayor of Mexico City. And this was the question that kept me up at night. How do you enter that city? Like, where do you even start? Especially because the communities and the sheer magnitude of the city had to be something that we worked with. So one of the things that also made us different and was one of the first intuitions that I think proved correct from the very beginning of the lab was the composition of the team. So first of all, it was a young team, 28 years on average, which is basically the average age of Mexico City. So in a certain sense, I think we were helping to prototype what government could look like for a younger generation. Second of it, half of my team came from urban sciences and profiles that you'd imagine within government, such as political scientists, internationalists, AI experts, civic tech, social sciences, but then the other half exactly came from the humanities. So that was also artists and philosophers and historians and architects and activists working hand in hand, and everything that we did sat exactly in between this sometimes uncomfortable, but I think incredibly fascinating place to be. And of course, being Mexico City, we also had a mass wrestler on the team, because how can you not? And before, Jorge used to keep his identities quite separate, but since The Guardian ousted him, now I speak very, very eloquently about Jorge, because I think he very well embodied the ethos that we wanted at the lab, because he was a political scientist. He's now specializing in mobility and transportation, but he's also one of the most lovable characters across the city that has been fighting for pedestrian rights for a long, long time. And I was incredibly touched when suddenly he found that his role as an activist could not necessarily go further. So he decided to step into government, one could argue into the cave of the wolf, to actually keep on working on his agenda. And this became a continuous thing throughout the development of the lab, where suddenly we had a lot of activists that had stones in their hands, and that was their way of relating to government, suddenly wanting to step into it, to the very entrails of that space, to actually affect change. So this was one of the questions that we had. every day, like conversations that we had every day, something that we had very close to our heart. Because as you can imagine, Mexico City has a 280,000 people bureaucracy, so we had to find our place in the world. And one of the things that, the ways that we did that was, first of all, thinking that language is a Trojan horse, but our metaphors also create our realities. So basically, the way that we divided our agenda by year 2 was about how do you create a playful city, a pedestrian city, a open city, a prototype city. And this actually did not allow us for us to fall into the stereotypes of, let's say, only thinking about mobility. Because when you think about a pedestrian city, you think of from a very different lens, much more transdisciplinary, that when you only think, oh, my thing is mobility. So this was what we had very much at our heart, is how do you think about that future city that we want? How do we once again discuss the type of cities and societies we want to create? But then what does specific experiments and tactical day-to-day things actually look like to edge forward those realities? This is what a year in the life of just one of the teams at the lab looked like. So it was everything from hosting conferences to specific interventions to changing laws, as you will see, to a little bit of everything. And this was one of our other main questions. And all of our experiments actually started with what we call the provocation, be it a vision for the city or be it a very specific project. And we found that very powerful because people that did not want to really collaborate with government became as obsessed as we did with these questions that we could pose to the city, and that was one of our convening powers, if you will. From the very onset, we decided to make the lab into a space that put it there, that really spoke to our ethos. So we took this little bit of a government department and made it very much into a space like this, a place where people would come for ideas and debates and to really think about that future of a city. And at the same time, we were working within the government of hosting a lot of events within for capacity building, because one of the things that we saw is, it's so interesting and so sad in a way that many times the reason why people step into government is they actually believe in the public good. But bureaucracy is so heavy and so lethargic that slowly, if you will, you start figuring out that it's easier to just stay put in your place. So one of the things that we really wanted to do was reinvigorate that sense of social purpose and social good. And also prototype collaborative societies in events such as this. It was our first data festival that had about 1,027 people sign up, including 100 mentors from government. So because we were based on humanities, besides the objective topographies of the city, we also believed hugely in social imaginaries and the symbolic infrastructure of the city, if you will. So Mexico City's second leading cause of death across the city was children. For children and adolescents was due to road incidents. So one of the specific projects that we worked on that I'll show how this actually plays out was the road safety plan for Mexico City. Could we get that down? Like this was a health crisis, right? So the experimental bit was bringing in all of the activists to do the road safety plan and to really co-create it. But we also wanted to have people get a sense of what we meant by a pedestrian city, because law is a paper and road safety plans can remain a paper, but having a sense of that city that we want to create and becoming an experiential thing becomes just as important. So we created events such as this, where Mexico City closed down for the first time ever, its elevated highway that is obviously a very car-based notion of a city, for pedestrians and bikers. We would also create projects with Ambulante, for example, which is an amazing documentary festival, so that they would take bike rides to get to the screening of films in public plazas. This, for example, was one that we did with Antanas Mocus, who used to be the mayor of Bogotá's leader of the youth agenda, speaking about a shift in civics, and you can see everything becomes a full house. For those of you who have a question mark, okay, but how much does culture actually influence reality? And how much does the idea that we have of ourselves actually also have a life of its own? This is our bike sharing system that has been around for 10 years. And when it was first implemented, everybody went crazy, both within and without government. It's like, what are you doing? This is a death wish. You're going to send people to a grave. This is Mexico City. It is not Copenhagen. Having a bike system, which became one of the largest in the world, actually changed our notion of the city that we are. And in the last Origin Destin that we just had, it turns out that we have 700,000 people using a bike every day, which is the size of Copenhagen. So this is what the symbolic power of cities do, and talking about communities, something that I'm very touched about, is the activist community in Mexico City become one of our strongest allies through Jorge and Pepe that also stepped into my team. So we had an earthquake 2 years ago, as you probably heard, and because of a very beautiful thing that we had a lot of people in their cars driving towards instead of away from disaster to help people, but we also created a huge traffic jam so ambulances and medicine and help could not get through. And it was actually the bike lane infrastructure and the bike activists of Mexico City that created brigades to get the first response help into that. So you create these communities that might be about one thing, but they also get activated when you are in the most critical circumstances that a city can live through. So this became something that very interesting to us, of asking us continuously this question. And we really thought that we needed very different ways to start this conversation within the different communities and societies of Mexico City. So every excuse was fabulous for us. This, for example, is the same Zócalo that you saw. And we asked during a yearly fair for them to give us that square there that you see, that it was the first time that Mexico City would have a pavilion. And what we did, instead of talking about government, because as you know, government loves to talk about itself, we decided how can we, in a plaza that naturally sees 2 million people filing through every day, actually create a conversation about the social projects that are happening across the city? Because one of the things about our scale is that many times we don't know the amazing things that are happening in different spaces. So how do you create creative contagion, if you will, across the city? So this is more or less what it looked like, and it was speaking about the social projects across the city. One of the examples was Isla Urbana. We have a huge water paradox, where on one hand we are running out of water in Mexico City. I won't get into it, but at the same time we actually have more rainfall than London in every given year. So what happens when you put in these Thank you, yes. These rain systems, and then we also not only showcased their work in the plaza to inspire others, we also sat them together with the Senate of Mexico City. And the last news of the 26th of September, actually, is that the new mayor of Mexico City is actually going to prototype in 100,000 houses in marginalized areas across the city what it actually means to start scaling these type of water systems. So one of the things that we always pushed for was a need actually of prototyping and of experimenting to figure out these futures that we want. So I'll show you why this becomes important. These are our buses in Mexico City. These are an informal bus system. So if any of you, until very recently, wanted to own one of these individually, you could just say, like, okay, I want a bus, which actually makes it one of the largest informal bus systems in the world that grew naturally along with the city. So there's about 30,000 of them because the city sprawled 35 times in size from the 60s to the 90s. And we've never had any idea of what happens on the ground. So it's very hard, as you can imagine, to drive transportation policy, especially because these little humble beasts move an astounding 16 million individual rides a day, which is, half the population of Canada, I believe. And it also makes it really hard as a user. So how do we even figure out a map? This is what they look like on the inside. So Patricio, that you see there standing at one of our events for creative bureaucrats, he came up and said, well, if you're really serious about solving things that are hard to solve creatively, like, here you go. Like, how the hell do we create a map for the city? Like, we really need this. So we did what we always do, which is create a hybrid, multidisciplinary team of people within and without government. And we thought, yes, how do we solve it? So we came up with an idea to be tested of saying, if we go down the classical route of hiring people, a consultation or whatever, it would be like a couple of $millions, no? But we have baby budgets at the lab, so that was not feasible. So we started working with a young tech company who created this interface and a citywide game. So we gamified the whole thing. And you could, if you rode on a bus from the very beginning to the end and mapped it, and it didn't need to use your data plan because we knew that this would be prohibitive for many people. It would actually simulate GTFS, the data standard for mobility, and it also had a smart algorithm that would push people to map the routes that we needed to map. No small feat, because we figured out that some of these routes actually took 9.5 hours to and fro, believe it or not. And to our huge surprise, because we did not know if this was going to work or not. We had 4,000 people signing up, 700 teams. These are the 100 winners that came to the unveiling of the first map for the bus system that Mexico City has ever had, which is this one. And the beautiful thing is that while Mexico City catches up with the rest of the world, I feel that we can also leap forward and start exploring new paradigms in their nascent stage. So I was really happy that some months later, Beth Novick, who used to be the chief technology officer for Obama, in the article that she wrote, she actually mentioned Mapaton as one of the ways that the future of government could actually go. So one of the things that we realized with this, because when 4,000 people sign up, is that your community is your superpower. Like 20 people within a city department can basically not even do like a tiny little burp in the landscape of a city. So this is what needs to happen, concentric circles of social structuring, and your community really is your superpower. A fabulous excuse that we had of really thinking about not only how do we join forces for very specific experiments, but actually to figure out what type of societies that we want was the Constitution for Mexico City. It was quite exciting because it was the first constitution to be drafted in this century, and it's also a city constitution, which is rare. So I was incredibly frightened as well as excited when I woke up one morning, and as often happened, I read the press that had come out that day, and I found out through the press that the mayor had entrusted the lab with actually creating more of a crowdsource, bringing in other voices into the creation of this constitution. So it was really interesting because it gathered quite a bit of international attention. Iceland had tried to crowdsource its constitution at one point in time, but as you probably know, there was a change of government, so it did not necessarily come into being. I am happy to say that the Mexico City Constitution is a thing nowadays, and it was incredibly interesting to think about the process. So first of all, the team around the Constitution, for starters, was quite fantastic. The mayor had entrusted 28 people from civil society to help draft it, and that was what he was going to hand over to the Constitutional Assembly that was made up of 100 people. It's a little bit complex to explain, so I'll be very brief about this, but whoever wants to hear more about this, I'd be very happy to go into it. But these 28 people had people such as Lolkin, who was the first woman to get married in Mexico City to another woman, so gay marriage, which is a thing. And Carlos Cruz, who used to be a gang member in the 90s and then decided that he needed to go to the other side because a lot of his friends started getting killed. He was actually a gang leader, not even a gang member. And now he has one of the most successful reinsertion programs of getting people out of gangs and into other type of creative practices. But then because of this crowdsourced constitution, we also had people such as Patricio, who's 17 years old at the time, and so he could not even vote, and whose ideas are now within the Constitution. And 84% of the people that we worked with, and the platforms that we created gathered about 500,000 people around it, are actually part of the draft that then got approved by the Constitutional Assembly. So constitutions, as always, are part a wish for the future, and yes, they are idealistic, and in a way, one of the criticisms was, is it a Santa Claus list? And yes, I think that who we aspire to be as a city is definitely part of that, but we're also seeing incredibly palpable effects because our Constitution has things such as euthanasia, it has things such as transsexual rights, medical marijuana, Indigenous rights, really brings up the gender conversation into constitutional law. And also something that is close to my heart, because we specifically worked on this with the first mayor of Mexico City and his fabulous team, was Article 20, which is Global City, which first of all is legally our notion of sanctuary city for Mexico City. So when the caravans pass through the city, they're actually guaranteed their full series of rights. And it also plays out a very new notion of urban diplomacy. And now, even though it went into court with the federal government, it passed as well. We can now sign our own international treaties so that policy that happens at the city level and international agreements can bypass the national government. And I think that we're seeing the world over that cities are becoming such a boiling place for ideas and things happening that sometimes hopefully can work with national government. Sometimes they actually have to be a very different impulse. So I have the feeling that these types of things that I would have never thought pre-government days, like these very geeky legal things, actually become incredibly interesting tools to create blueprints of the type of societies that we want. But since we were a lab, besides working on these more abstract yet very powerful levels, we also wanted to always put our money where our mouth was and drive it back into the communities themselves. So while we were doing this, we were also working with an amazing group of deportees. As you probably know, there's 2.5 planes that get sent back nowadays to Mexico City, notwithstanding from where in the Republic they are. And so we have a huge issue of how do we actually incorporate these people coming back and think about how to unlock the talent that is there instead of this being a hindrance. The beautiful thing is that they're actually self-organizing. The person you see here, where it says deported but not defeated, he was actually deported as well, and now they're self-organizing, and they welcome the planes, and they help people to figure out the very complex labyrinth, which is Mexico City, and help them get jobs. So how to help people help themselves, I think, should become one of the central questions around community building. And one of our favorite groups of people that we work very closely with, they had some amazing projects like the Deportacos and the Deportaguas, and also doing a lot of screen printing to gather momentum and gather funds that were then pushed back into the communities and help create jobs for the people coming back, as well as jobs for themselves. So how does government actually become not only a provider of services, but really think that the biggest, most underutilized resource of our cities are their communities, and the civic power, I think, is one of the biggest questions that need to be addressed, because it is the only way to scale. And I feel that even though I'm enthralled by everything from behavioral economics and nudge units, you can only trick your people so far into doing the right thing. What we need to bring is everybody together into every time more profound conversations, not easy conversations, but again, about the cities and societies that we want to become. Thank you very much.